right, hello, everybody. So for those who don't know me, I'm Connor O'Keefe. I'm on staff here at the Mises Institute. The title of my talk is the Rothbardian Insights on the Political Economy of Mass Media. The unofficial title could be Why the Media is Bad, basically. And so, like I said, I'm on staff here, and in addition to running around and doing AV, like I've been doing all week, I write a weekly article, I produce video content here, and I'm a co-host on one of our podcasts. And all of that revolves around current events. So over the last few years, I've been reading a lot of news. And over that period, I've become fascinated by the news media itself and by media criticism. I think, people are always complaining about the news, and for good reason, which we'll get to. But when I talk about media criticism or media critics, I'm talking about the scholars, journalists, and pundits who focus on what the media gets wrong and why it gets it wrong. I've also come to believe that most people, including a lot of us in our sort of world here, I think that we severely underappreciate just how important the media is. To put it in more Misesian terms, we're all actors, of course. We act using means to achieve certain ends. And what we decide to do as actors is built on our understanding of reality, our internal model of reality. And our internal model of reality is indistinguishable from reality itself, at least to us. And everything we understand about the world that does not come from our personal experience or the experience of those close to us that's relayed directly to us, everything else that we understand about how the world works comes to us through media. For things like history, we mostly rely on books or other media products that themselves rely on books. But for current events, for our entire understanding of what's happening in the world outside of our personal experience and word of mouth, it all comes from the news media. And I'd say even in the internet age, when we talk about how young people are getting almost all their news from social media, that's usually referring to some online personality that's reacting to a story that was broken by like the Wall Street Journal or Reuters or something like that. And again, because our internal model of reality is indistinguishable from reality itself to us, if that news coverage is framed in a misleading way or is outright false, we can easily develop a completely delusional worldview without even noticing. So yeah, the news media is important. And so understanding how it works is important too. Unfortunately, most people that are dominating that conversation are, let's just say, lacking when it comes to their understanding of economics or the nature of government. I think Austrian economists and libertarians need to have a bigger presence in this discussion, in this debate. That's one of the reasons I'm drawn to this topic. So like it says in the title, I'm looking to apply Rothbardian insights. Rothbard himself did write about the news media, but it's not a topic he focused on a lot. So when I say Rothbardian insights, I'm talking about the broader understanding of where power resides in society and how the state interacts with the market, that like the broader Rothbardian tradition is sort of advancing. So this is a huge topic. There's a lot of work and research that can be done on it, a lot more than I can cover in 30 minutes. So I'm just gonna run through a couple concepts that I think are important for understanding the American media news system. So let's dive in. The media is an industry. It's obviously part of the economy. In the US, it's mostly private companies with a few government-funded or semi-government-funded outlets. However, what makes the media different from just about any other industry is that most people consider the media to have an important public role. It goes beyond public good. It's seen as a crucial public institution, a vital part of our democratic political system. You'll sometimes hear it referred to as the fourth estate and spoken about as being just as important as the three branches of government, basically. And almost any given criticism of the media that you hear is, at the end of the day, an accusation that the journalist or outlet is failing in this almost sacred role. Unlike other industries, the success or failure of the media is not judged, at least by those outside the industry, by how much money they bring in, but by how well they inform the public about the news and issues of the day. Even among right-wingers and anti-establishment folks who are not typically, as enthusiastic about our current democratic political process as most people, even among them, criticism of the media still tends to boil down to it failing to live up to this democratic ideal. And most commonly, the blame for that is placed on the incentives of business, or more precisely, on the profit and loss system. The media itself is constantly complaining about how their interests as businesses are corrupting their industry and hurting their ability to fulfill their sacred public role. Most media criticism out there breaks down in like a partisan way. You have Democrat media critics like Brian Stelter and Aaron Rupar, they're on the left, who are essentially advancing this narrative that the entire media is generally doing great work, except for Fox News. And that Fox News is this singularly flawed entity within the media ecosystem that is greedily telling their conservative audience exactly what they want to hear, and therefore profiting off of the demise of our country. And Republican media critics, like the shows and organizations there on the right, they tend to present the exact same narrative in reverse. Fox and other right-leaning networks are doing real journalism, while the other side, the other networks, are infected by liberal bias and then are similarly profiting as they sort of whip their blue audiences up into a frenzy to the detriment of our country. Most of this media criticism I find to be pretty unsophisticated, but even among more sophisticated media critics, like these are two of my favorites, Matt Taibbi and Glenn Greenwald, even them, they both, they're more left-leaning, but they have a very good understanding of where power resides in society, and I think they speak a lot to the true bipartisan nature of the permanent power structure in Washington. They're definitely not in that partisan blame game like some of those folks on the last slide, but even they tend to come back to the media being worse or becoming worse because it's more profitable. So let's get into that argument. And to do so, I don't want to straw man, I don't want to present a fairly weak or lazy form of that argument. There are plenty of them out there. I want to use the strongest version of the argument, and I believe that comes from Matt Taibbi in his book, Hate, Inc., which I highly recommend, but it's a very good book. Taibbi is certainly not naively romantic about how the news used to be, but to help explain what he sees as the problem that we have now, he first goes back and looks at the media and how it worked before. And to do that, he points to broadcast media in the second half of the 20th century, back in the days of Walter Cronkite. He, again, admits that this era tends to be romanticized too much, but it is true that media organizations at the time were very different from what we have today. And the reason for that, he argues, is because they were trying to reach everyone at once. He says the news used to try to be extremely uninsulting to avoid alienating anyone. In the book, he sort of paints this picture of a family with a multitude of political beliefs, from a crazy right-wing uncle to a young socialist cousin. And he says the broadcaster's goal was for this entire politically diverse family to be able to watch the same news program. And in a business where more viewers equals more advertiser demand, which equals more revenue, that's a very understandable strategy. But all that began to change in the 1990s with Fox News. So in 1996, Rupert Murdoch and Roger Ailes, they decided to adopt a new strategy for their new cable news network. Instead of trying to reach everyone, Fox would target a subset of the population, obviously older conservative Americans. Pretty quickly, it became clear that even though this was a smaller group, tailoring news coverage to the interests, biases, and fears of that smaller group got them addicted to the news to a degree that hadn't really been seen before. It was a very successful strategy and therefore a major market signal. Eventually, the same approach was adopted by the other political news networks on cable, really by necessity, leading to the very politically skewed setup we have today. Interestingly, CNN made a serious attempt back in 2023 to transition away from that and to go back to a model where their coverage would be able to reach everyone, and it went terribly for them. They were hemorrhaging money and viewers, so the higher-ups fired the guy in charge of the change, and they've mostly abandoned that project, which really backs up the argument that a major reason the networks are acting this way is because otherwise is bad for business. Taibbi argues that the same approach has spread to almost every corner of the news media, including outlets that used to be held in high regard by everyday people, not necessarily those of us at the Mises Institute. And he says this really accelerated during the Trump years. It's also true with a lot of what we may call the new media online. Not all of it, but many of the shows, networks, blogs, and outlets that do well online appeal mainly to a specific party or ideology. So these media critics like Taibbi, they argue that these media businesses are financially incentivized to tell their audiences what they want to hear, even when it's misleading or untrue. So, after the last week, I really hope that all of you are very skeptical whenever you hear somebody blame the profit and loss system for an industry being terrible. You should be. And indeed, I do think there's a major problem with the argument I just laid out. But the problem is not that it's inaccurate. I think that it is dangerously incomplete, and to see why, we need to ask an important follow-up question. So again, media outlets are incentivized to provide their audiences with the news they want to consume, even when that news is biased, misleading, or outright false. The question is, why is that a problem? Or said differently, why specifically is that a problem? Media critics tend to stop after demonstrating that something in the media or something the media presented as true is actually misleading or false. But if that alone were the problem, we'd also be hearing a lot about the danger of things like reality television or professional wrestling, for example. Both contain moments that either through deceptive editing or sometimes just outright staging are completely fake, but are presented to the audience as being true. And yet people aren't building careers exclusively detailing the falsehoods of these television products, or at least not many people. Now, obviously this is not what we're talking about. We're talking about programs that are meant to inform people about current events, not these pure entertainment products. But then what about sports media or these gossip magazines? These media products share a lot of characteristics with what we were talking about earlier. The world of sports media is full of bias, especially local sports media. And tabloids like this are notorious for putting together very misleading narratives based on the flimsiest rumors and gossip. And I'm not going to pretend that nobody has a problem with these products, but it's not like 92.9 The Game in Atlanta or People magazine are driving the same kind of panic about misinformation and fake news that Fox News or the New York Times are. Why? This is where I think having a Rothbardian worldview is clarifying. The answer is that biased, misleading, and outright false news is only ever translated into widespread real-world harm through the political system. And in this case, I'm talking about democracy. It's true with any kind of state, as Rothbard mentioned over and over again, every state is affected by public opinion, but this is institutionalized and accelerated by the democratic process. Democracy gives people an avenue to take their false or even delusional worldviews and force them on other people at gunpoint, as everything is done through a state. But that's not all. The democratic system also feeds into the problems with the media too. Because we have effectively zero chance whatsoever of swaying an election alone, and because the political system is so socialized, meaning the costs of policies are so spread around, we face no immediate direct consequences for being wrong in our role as a voter. So we have no reason not to consume whatever news we find to be the most entertaining or the most comforting and confirming of our worldviews. So to put that in writing, by providing the public with a means to force their worldviews on others while protecting them from the consequences of being wrong, the democratic political system drives the prevalence of inaccurate news and gives it an outlet to cause widespread harm. That outlet doesn't exist for professional wrestling. It doesn't exist for reality TV, sports media, or celebrity tabloids, but it does exist for any news relating to the actions of the state, which is why inaccuracies with that kind of media is considered such a pressing problem. Said another way, the media isn't damaging because of the profit and loss system. It's damaging because of the political system. One second here. But it isn't like all the problems with the media are due to passive institutional pressures. The government itself does a lot to try to control and warp the media to its own benefit. After all, it needs to. As Rothbard goes over in the third section of his essay, Anatomy of the State, the long-run problem for any state that wishes to preserve itself is ideological. It's all about ideas. It's about what the population thinks about the legitimacy and benefits of government actions. And like I said at the beginning, because the news media is so important for how we understand how the world works, for how we build our internal model of reality, the government needs to exert some level of control over it, not only for its benefit, but for its very existence. And throughout history, one of the most common ways the ruling classes have sought to control the media has been through heavy-handed censorship. That's been happening since the printing press created what we think of today as the mass media. And the US government is no different. The peak of the US government using that approach, I believe, happened under Woodrow Wilson, especially when his administration cracked down on anti-war dissent in the lead up to and during America's involvement in World War I. People were thrown in prison for speaking out and writing against the war, and that included journalists. And even today, the Espionage Act, which was passed under Wilson, is still held over the heads of any journalist that's looking into, often a national security related story that the government would rather the public not know. However, I think with the exception of the social media censorship we saw after Trump got elected, and then especially during the COVID years, I think that this heavy-handed approach in the US has been secondary to another much more effective strategy, which is the weaponization of media access. That approach actually predates Wilson. Teddy Roosevelt was sort of the pioneer of it. There's an urban legend that one night in 1900, Roosevelt noticed some reporters huddled outside the White House in the rain, looking for sources, and he invited them in, thus forming the White House press pool. The story probably didn't happen, but the imagery of a president inviting struggling journalists in from a cold, rainy night and giving them access to the White House is perfect symbolism, I believe, for how the American government handles the press. It appears benevolent and on the surface as if it's embodying some democratic principle of transparency. But by bringing certain journalists in, excluding others, and retaining the power to revoke access, the government gained leverage and control over much of the press. But it really wasn't until the decades after the World Wars, when our political class was trying to demonize the Soviets, in large part for their crackdown on the press, that our government seems to have recognized the effectiveness of Roosevelt's approach. As I put it in an article once, the US government came to recognize that the key to good media censorship does not lie in muzzling the watchdogs, but in transforming them into lapdogs. Fast forward to today, this is the main way the US government controls the media. The press pool that Roosevelt unofficially formed is now an official thing. It's organized by an independent organization called the White House Correspondents Association. For people outside the media, they're most famous for hosting the White House Correspondents' Dinner every year, but their main function is as the group that decides which outlets get access to the White House press briefings, who gets to accompany the president on trips, and then within that, which journalists get to travel with the president on Air Force One. However, the independence of this process is a complete illusion because the White House decides which outlets are eligible for the WHCA to pick in the first place. The government is controlling the whole process. Trump has actually changed this in his second term. His administration now chooses who gets access to briefings directly, which they bypass the WHCA, and the media is trying to spin that as an assault on press independence. But the White House was already in effect controlling or picking who got in, or at least deciding on the options. Anyway, this level of access granting may have begun with the White House, but it's now spread to basically every part of the federal government, the most effective of which might be the Pentagon. Back during the Vietnam War, the government got very upset with all the Western journalists roaming around the country, reporting on the war and shining light on aspects of it that the government didn't want the public to know about. So when the Gulf War started in 1991, the Pentagon tried something new. They did the media the favor of creating or of granting them access to an official government-sanctioned media center near the Iraqi border, where they were fed information that officials wanted the public to know. Then occasionally, some of those journalists would get to go join American troops and tour specific areas on and around the front lines. Peter Van Buren, who's a writer now, he used to work for the State Department, and when he did, he embedded with combat troops on a number of occasions. He's written about this in a number of articles. I included a QR code to one of them. He talks about that basically to the government's delight, it quickly became clear that putting heavy restrictions on what embedded journalists could ask or report on was unnecessary, in large part because the thrill of getting to ride around in armored vehicles with a bunch of heavily armed guys who were both interested by and working to protect the reporters as if they were VIPs was seductive, as he calls it. These embedded reporters and their crews began pumping out what was effectively pro-war propaganda that went far beyond anything the Pentagon comms teams could have gotten away with. And presidents, too, have used embedded journalists for similar reasons. George W. Bush, for example, made sure a reporter was with him to document his secret plane ride to Baghdad in 2003. He picked Mike Allen, who would eventually go on to help start Axios. And Allen wrote this absurdly dramatic account of the whole trip. He served his purpose well. And 20 years later, back in 2023, when Biden took his secret train ride to Ukraine, to Kiev, his team made sure a New York Times journalist, photographer, was there to document the whole thing. They also had other journalists there to write similarly dramatic chronicles of Biden's courageous ordeal. These are great examples of how the government uses access to control media narratives. These were publicity stunts. The journalists weren't tacked on to cover these trips. They were the entire point of the trips. And it could probably go without saying, but getting access to the top officials in the government or the people on the front lines of a war is an enormous advantage in our highly government-centered media ecosystem. It's essentially an indirect subsidy. And when we're talking like on the scale of decades here, this level of access from the White House and eventually almost every other part of the federal government went a long way in making the handful of media outlets that the government chose to give access to into the most prominent outlets in the industry, the group that we now usually refer to as the mainstream media or the legacy press. In the decades since the World Wars, these newspapers and networks came to dominate the industry and exert an enormous amount of control over how the American public understood the world. And because the government was so crucial for creating and maintaining their status and position as long as they were on good behavior, it meant the government had a good deal of control over how the public saw the world too. But to end on a little bit more of an optimistic note, that control is slipping. I don't think it's very controversial to say we're going through a major transformation in the media space. But I do believe the best explanation of the nature and significance of that transition comes from this book, Revolt of the Public. Another QR code up there if you're interested. Very good read. In it, the author argues that one of the most important factors that has determined where power resides in society throughout human history has been the technological setup of the information space. Specifically, he identifies 5 distinct phases or waves, as he calls them. He argues that the rise of writing and alphabets revolutionized how humans could spread information around, and because of the logistical constraints of the media, it also centered a lot of power into the literate, priestly, and bureaucratic classes in society. So the institutions and dynasties that came to dominate in the old order, or as Rothbard calls them, the Austrian regime, not referring specifically to the pre-revolutionary French government, but kind of the monarchies, religious institutions, and bureaucratic merchant and banking dynasties that made up the ruling classes at that time. These ruling classes dominated in large part because they enjoyed a monopoly over the media environment of the day. But that monopoly was shattered with the invention of the printing press. The author of that book, he argues that it's no accident that some of the biggest political changes in history happened shortly after printing became more widely available. Things like the liberal revolutions, the Reformation, all that stuff, but it's about a 500-year transition. But what he argues is that it's not so much that there was a sudden change in the public's sentiments, but that these changes happened because abrupt changes in the information space allowed sentiments that were already there to spread and develop outside of the ruling class's control. Like I said, it took a long time, about 500 years. I think the World Wars was sort of the true end of that, especially World War I. And the process was not smooth at all. It was pretty rough. But eventually that global old order was replaced by the current global elite, which came to power in large part because they gained a lot of control over the new information technologies, the printing press, and eventually the airwaves. However, the book argues, and I think it's hard to deny, that the internet has fractured the current global elite's monopoly over the information space, and it has done so to a degree that goes way beyond what happened with the adoption of the printing press. And a lot of the craziness we've seen in politics in recent years is because we are in the early stages of a similar widespread transition from one ruling class to another. That's his argument. Of course, the government here and governments across the globe are attempting to gain control over the internet to preserve their monopoly over the information space. But I don't think in the long run they'll succeed. I think they will kick and scream and fight hard, and they can cause a lot of damage, don't get me wrong, and they'll find new ways of threatening our freedoms. But I think the nature of the internet means that they will never enjoy anything close to the level of control they had over the media and over the public's understanding of the world that they did just a few decades ago. If that's true, then significant changes are coming. I mean, in many ways, they're already happening, which I believe, just to wrap up here, I believe really speaks to the importance of programs like this, like Mises University and what the Mises Institute is doing. We've always been in a battle of ideas, but there may never have been another time in history when that battle had the potential to be more fruitful. Thank you.